Hey, how's it going, everyone? Today we've got a video for you where we're going to be doing some testing in React. So if we take a look here, we've got this image gallery React app, and we want to do some testing on it, make sure it's working correctly. But there's a few tricky things going on that we're going to need to figure out how to handle. So let's take a look at this component and then figure out what's difficult and how we can solve it. So if we look here, we have a component did mount that calls fetch images. Now, what this function does is A, it's asynchronous, and B, it makes an external AJAX recall to the Unsplash API. So that's what we're going to figure out how to test in this video. How to solve sort of asynchronous React components and make sure that they're working fine, and how to mock this call so that it doesn't make the real API call, but instead uses a fake version of it. And so what this does is it updates the state to say that we're searching, and then it awaits the response from Unsplash, and it updates the state again with the results, the images, and otherwise it catches an error. So down here in the render, we're not going to spend too much time here specifically. But basically it maps the images that are in the state, and it outputs an image component for each one of them. So let's see what we can do first to get this testing correctly. Now our first problem is that this is an AJAX call, and it's very hard to test this in its current format. So we're going to refactor this call, basically this await Axios get. I'm going to cut it, and we'll come back to this code in a sec, and we're going to move it to its own service. Basically just a function that I'm calling a service, but we're going to put in a new location. So we'll come over here, we'll create a services folder, and we will create one called unsplash.js. So in here we need to import Axios, because that's what we're using to do the AJAX request. And then we'll export default an async function, which will receive the term. And then we got a little arrow function here where we're going to paste our actual AJAX call. So if the term is received, it does this. So we want to, we'll put this into a variable, const response, and then we'll await for it. And then once we've got that, we can return response.data. In Axios, this is how you access the body of the response. And it's got something called results in this case. It's an object that has a results array that's basically one for each image. So now that we've got this here in its own little function, we can use that instead of having this call inline in our component. So we'll go back here. We'll import it first. So import unsplash from /services unsplash, like that. And then we'll come down here, and now we're not just getting a response, we're actually returning the images right away. And we'll call our unsplash function, passing it the term that was sent to us here. So what we're doing in this app is basically when it loads, we're searching for mountains right away so that the user gets to see something right away on the screen. And so that will be the term, essentially, mountains. We'll call the function, we'll get the response, and put the images into our state. So let's just load the page. Oh, we've got an error. Images.map is not a function. Why is that? Oh, I know why. Because this returns a promise, so we need to, it's an async function, meaning it returns a promise, so we need to await for that promise to be resolved and give us the response. So now it's working correctly. We could search for llamas if we want, and it seems to work fine. So now that we've done a little bit of refactoring on this app, we want to actually test our app component. So let's go in here and we'll write a test. So new file, app.test.js. And the first thing we need to do is import our app component. So import app from app, just like that. Okay. So what we want to test is that it fetches images from Unsplash and renders them on mount. So it's a little bit of a long name, but it's very descriptive. And then we'll do our arrow function here. Okay, so here's where it's going to get a little bit different. And we're going to use something called Jest mocks. And we're going to have to deal with the asynchronous nature of this code. Because if you come back here and look at the app, so when the component did mount, it calls fetch images, but we don't get a response right away from the Unsplash API. It returns a promise, so we wait for it and then update the state. So if we want to test that it works correctly, we need to deal with this asynchronous nature of our code. And the first thing we need to solve is that in our test, we don't actually want to hit the Unsplash API because A, that's going to make our test really slow. You're not always able to hit the real API when you're testing. Like say you're making a payment or something like that. You can't actually make a payment every time you run your tests. So basically we need a way to make a fake version or a mock in other terms of this Unsplash function. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to come back here, and before we even fill in this part of our test, we're going to use jest.mock, and we're going to tell it which module in this case we want to mock. Because Unsplash lives in its own file and it exports default. So essentially it's a module that's being imported elsewhere into our app component here. So what we need to do is jest.mock, and we need to point it towards the service basically that we're trying to mock. So we go up a level, gets us to components, and then we can go into services and then into Unsplash. Okay. So this is what we want to mock, but we haven't actually built the ability to have it mock yet. So what you do in Jest is you come over here to the services folder, and we create a special folder called __ mocks. And in it, we create a module with the same file name, so unsplash.js. So now in here, we can create a fake version of the real version of this function here. So we want to have it follow the same sort of signature. So it exports default an asynchronous function, which takes a term and returns some, it waits for a result and returns some results. So what we'll do is we'll say export default an async function, which takes a term, and then we'll start filling in this code here. So if we come back here, we see that it awaits for something that returns a promise. And when this promise resolves, it essentially gives us the images. So let's just follow the same signature of what this does. So we're going to say that we've got const response equals, we're going to await for a promise to resolve. So we'll just create a new promise. And this receives resolve, and we write our code here. So then we need to have this promise resolve. So we can call resolve and basically pass it the images here. So let's create some fake data then, and we'll have it resolve with this fake data. So we've got const fake data, and it will be an array. And we want to have this fake data look like the real data that's returned from the real Unsplash API. So if we come over here to app and sort of follow where the images are being used, we can see that each image is mapped and passed into the image component. And right away we can see that each image has an ID. So we'll give it an ID of 1 just in our fake data here. And then we'll open up the image component and we'll see what it needs. So this is where it would have been much better if I had proper prop types. Maybe, you know what, why don't we do this at the same time? So image is an object, which is what I have here, but it doesn't tell us anything about the shape of this object. So we'll say that it has a shape, and what it looks like is that each image has, it looks like categories, which is an array that is an object that has a title. So we'll say it has categories, which is prop types dot array of, and it's an array of a prop types dot shape, which is an object that has a title, which is a prop types dot string. All right, it's getting a little complicated, no, this prop types thing. We can see that it has a user, which is also an object, so shape, and that has a name, so we'll do prop types dot string as well here. So now we've covered this code here. It looks like it has links.html. So we've got links, which is prop types dot shape, and that's got HTML, which is a string. We're almost done. We've got an image has likes, which is a number, and URLs, which is an object that has a small URL. So URLs is a prop types dot shape, which has a small, which is a prop types dot string, and we've got likes, which is a prop types dot number. Cool. So this is basically what an image looks like. It's got an array of categories. Each category has a title. It's got a user, links, URLs, and likes. So we need our fake data to mimic this. So I'm just going to copy this over so I can remember what it looks like. And we'll say we've got categories, which has an array of an object that has a title. We'll just say nice image. We've got user, which has a name, Mr. Photographer. We've got URLs, which has a small one, which is, we'll just take it to my website, halliday.com. We've got, oh, no, we'll do links. And then URLs is the actual image, which has a small. Doesn't really matter, so just image.com/nice.jpg. Last one is likes, we'll have 10. Cool. So I can remove this, and now we've got our fake data. And we're resolving this with this fake data, which gets sent to our response. And then we'll just return our response here. So we could shorten this even more by just returning this here. So just to explain this code, because it's a little bit dense, we have an asynchronous function, which is going to return whatever this promise resolves, which is our fake data up here, an array of images. So we're going to wait for it to resolve and then return what it gives us. So now we've created a fake version of the real Unsplash function. So let's go use it. We come over here to the test we're writing. And the first thing we need to do is, because we're not testing synchronous code, we have to receive an additional done parameter, which is a function you call once this test is done, essentially. Because it can't sort of wait till it gets to the end of the function because things are happening asynchronously out of order. So we just call done when it's ready to have been finished. So the first thing I want to do is essentially shallow render using enzyme this component. So what we'll do is we'll say wrapper equals shallow app. So now we've got a shallow render of this app. Shallow is a function which comes from enzyme. The reason I can use it is because I've got some test setup that imports shallow from Enzyme and makes it global right here. So that way I can just use it in my test without having to import it and whatnot. And now I need to basically test to make sure that things are working correctly. So let's say that we want to use our wrapper and test that it's rendering one image, because that's what our fake data consists of. So we come over here and it's got an array of images, so it should render one of these image components. So what we can do is we can say expect wrapper.findImage.length 2 equal 1. So we'll run this test. It's going to shallow render this app, and we're going to make sure that it finds one image. So we'll get out of here and we'll run our tests. Yarn test. We wait for it to run and it fails. It says it's received 0, but we know because we mocked out our API call, it should be returning one image here. So there's a reason for this. And the reason is that even though we mocked our function, it's still a promise, which means it still happens asynchronously. So we basically need to wait for that to finish, that promise to resolve, and then we want to do our test. And there's a little bit of a trick you can use to make that happen. Essentially in JavaScript, we want to wait for the next process.tick. And what you can do for that is you can use a set timeout. So we'll use a set timeout, except we won't provide sort of, normally when you use these, you say like run like 1 second later. In this case, we don't want it to run second later. We just want it to run as soon as possible. But the way JavaScript works, it will wait till the next tick. And by that point, our promise should have resolved itself. And then we can make sure that it's equal to 1. So we come back here and we check. And it's telling us that the async callback was not invoked within timeout specified by Jasmine default timeout interval. So there's a couple things we can do to solve that. One thing we need to do is we need to tell Jest when this test should be done. So we do that by calling the done function. And it's still going to fail. And the reason it fails is because we just shallow rendered this app once. And because things have happened, the state has updated, we need to basically explicitly tell our shallow wrapper to update itself, to re-render, so that we can find the image and make sure that there's one of them. So what we can do for that is we can say wrapper.update. And now our test pass. So we come in here, we import our app, we tell it to don't use the real Unsplash service, use the mocked version of it. And we shallow render our app, but we write our code in a timeout so that we wait till the next tick when all the promises would have resolved. And then we can tell it to explicitly update, to re-render. And then we'll go into the wrapper, find all of the image components and get the length of them, which should be 1, because that's how many images are in our fake data. So let's test one more thing. Let's say we want to make sure that it set the state correctly. Because if you come back here to this fetch images function, it's changed the status to searching and whatnot. But once it's finished waiting and it's returned the result here, it should have a status of done, and in the state should be all of the images it found. So we can test that as well. And the way we do that is we'll put the state in a variable. And the way we access it is getting the instance of the wrapper, and then we can access the state. So the instance is basically the instance of the app component itself. And once we have that, then we can go and access its state. So So now that we have the state, we can just write some tests to say that we expect the state dot term to equal, I think it was mountains. Still passing, just rerun them to make sure. We can expect the state.status to equal done. And we can expect the state.images.length to equal 1. And it's all passing correctly. Rerun it, it's good. So essentially what we've done, if we just step back to the beginning and walk through this process again quickly, we took our app component that was making an AJAX call sort of within this fetch images function, and we extracted it. We extracted it to this Unsplash function that returns a promise of, and eventually it will give us the images once it's resolved. So we go over here and we just created a little function which receives the term, waits for the AJAX call to finish, and returns the images, accessing it through response.data.results. By doing that, by putting this function into its own module, now we can mock that module in our test so that we don't use the real one, we use our fake version of it. So we did that by importing our app and then telling Jest that we wanted to mock that module. And when you tell it to mock that module, Jest looks within the same folder that you pointed to, but it looks in a mocks folder, and that's __ mocks, lowercase, __, and it looks for the same file name here. So in here, we basically created a similar version with the same sort of signature and way it performs to the real one. So we exported an asynchronous function which receives the term, and it's going to return once this promise resolves, so it's going to wait for it. And this promise, since we created sort of a fake promise that resolves instantly, it resolves with our fake data, which is up here. So now that we have that, we can go back to our test. We can shallow render our app, but because, remember, things happen asynchronously, we can use this little trick of putting our code in a set timeout, and that will make it happen at the next tick. We can force our component to re-render, and then we can use this wrapper.instance to get the state, make sure that it's set correctly, and then we can go in and find the image component and see how many it found, because it always sort of returns like an array of however many it found. And we can check that it's equal to 1 because that's how many images we have. And because our test happens asynchronously, we need to pass a done function to this arrow function for our test and explicitly call it when our test has finished running. And that's how you can test asynchronous components in React, in Jest, by mocking the module and creating fake versions of it. Hope you enjoyed the video. Take care.